Welcome everyone to another virtual program with Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman. It is June 7th, 2021, and this is Historic Taverns and Tea Rooms of Maine, a book launch with Bill and Kathy Kenny. Thank you so much for being here with us. Bill and Kathy are here to talk about their new book. Kathy is a retired librarian whose deep love of books, history, and antique quilts has led her to a second career as a quilt historian, educator, and lecturer. Her extensive vintage antique quilt collection allows her to enhance the different periods of America's history for her audience and give them a closer, more hands-on approach to learning about various events in our nation's history, such as the story of tea and tea rooms during the year of the women's suffrage movement. She has been featured in several magazines and has been this featured speaker for a vast number of historical societies and women's groups from Maine to Colorado. Presenting a bit of history from a woman's perspective in this, her first book, reflects her many years of collecting stories of historical interest. Bill Kenny is a former career U.S. Air Force Logistics War Planner, Joint Special Operations Commander, Intelligence Officer, and Gulf War veteran, as well as a retired adjunct university professor who taught international economics, public affairs, organizational leadership, and other courses at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. He has always had a keen interest in history, especially Maine history. This is his second book. His first book, released by the History Press in June 2020, titled A History of Maine Railroads, was a great success. And Bill did the launch for that book with Maine Historical Society too. So please visit our website and you can see the recorded version of that program. Bill has traveled across the state and via Zoom to talk about this important time in Maine history. And you can visit his website, historymaine.com. Thank you so much, Kathy and Bill, for being with us this evening. I know the audience joins me in welcoming you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's so good to have you here. I am going to bring up the presentation for everyone to see, and whenever you're ready, you may begin.
Thank you for joining us tonight to take this trip down to history with us. It's sort of interesting because I wrote this book. Basically, I got intrigued by it because the first book was talking about the railroad starting about the 1820s going forward. And when I was doing the research, I saw all about the stagecoaches and the taverns and places they stopped, which later became train stops. So I'm doing the history backwards. Now I'm going back starting in the mid-1600s and going forward. If you'd hold your questions, we'll answer them at the end of the presentation rather than during the presentation. First of all, Maine's taverns and tea rooms reflect the backbone of Maine's character, and its existing buildings themselves are tangible proof of the state's resiliency and history. The variety of these taverns and tea rooms presents an overview of community, commerce, and politics during Maine's growth as a state. Taverns were established in the late 1600s and early 1700s to serve the community. Tea rooms weren't established until the early 1900s, giving women business and financial independence. Kathy will talk more about those later. Next slide, please. Next slide. Most communities in Maine were along the coast and rivers. Now, I want to put this in context. So when you start, don't think about Maine as we think about it today. There was very little settlements inland at all. It was all along the coast. Most of the residents lived along the coast and the rivers. They rarely traveled more than 25 miles from where they lived. They had no reason to. The roads were merely rutted paths. They were very muddy and impassable. Think of just the old Indian paths, and that's basically what they were to start with. Now, before we go into talk about the taverns, I want to clarify some things. Taverns, you'll also hear her as ordinaries, and that was a term that was used until about the mid-1700s, when you don't hear it anymore. So if you see the word ordinaries or taverns in your readings, they're the same thing. and inns. Now, the basic difference is taverns were places where the community met. And when they started having people stay overnight, they became inns. They just added some rooms to the taverns, rented them out, and they're inns. And the first taverns in Maine in the mid 1600s to the late 1600s were along the coast in the town of Elliot, York, Belfast, North Yarmouth, Brunswick, Machias, and Falmouth, which is now called Portland. Now, fishing was the primary way of life. 80% of the products that they needed, the grains, the horses, the powder for their guns and so forth, muskets, all had to come from overseas. So they weren't trading with individual towns, they were trading with England. So it was basically not from town to town. There was little little need to travel outside the village. If you did it by boat. Most of the settlements you would visit would be the neighboring one, and you just go by boat. Supplies came by boat. Later, the food, the horseback, and stagecoach started getting developed as they connected those towns along the coast. Next slide, please. This shows a map of what the settlements were like in the mid to late 1600s. As you can see, they're all along the coast. There wasn't any developments inland unless they went up the river just a little bit, up the Sebeck River especially. Otherwise than that, they didn't go very far. Again, they weren't trading with each other, they were trading with England. And their primary way of making a living was self-sufficiency, but they also came here to fish. Maine had an abundance of ocean fish, and that's why they settled here, was the fish primarily. So everything else had to come from somewhere else. Now, later on in the early to mid 1700s, they started harvesting timber and selling the lumber again to England. Next slide, please. I show this picture, it's a little bit later. This is Haymarket Square in Bangor in the, well, I'd say about the 1740s, 1730s. And I show this to show you how rudimentary the towns were. They were just basically mud, and roads were in existence. They just did what they needed to do to come into town to get their supplies or whatever and go back to doing their farming and to doing their fishing. But this gives you an idea how rudimentary it was. Next slide, please. When we talk about large food and drink in the taverns, we want to talk about why taverns became so important. Taverns were the community center. Oftentimes they were built right next to the church in the town. So the churches weren't heated. After they spent time in church, they'd go next door to have an ale or to have lunch or whatever and to get warm. But that's also where, when they started to have overnighters and became inns, it's important to understand that they were very rudimentary. There were flea-bitten mattresses on the floor. You often would have 2 or 3 people to a bed, even with strangers. They didn't feel like they had full occupancy unless they had 2 or 3 people in each bed when they were traveling. They always played a crucial role in the community because they served as the gathering places and as a respite for travelers, offering food and overnight lodging. Travelers, when they came to the taverns, they brought news from outside the area. This was also, there were no town halls. There were no government buildings, so the government was run inside the taverns. If you look at in Philadelphia for the first Congress, it was in a tavern. So this is the type of things they had. All the government meetings were held in taverns, and they also had court proceedings that were in taverns. For example, John Adams, who was a circuit judge for the British, this was before we were just the District of Maine, part of Massachusetts, would have to travel as a circuit judge. One of the places he traveled to by horseback, not by stagecoach or anywhere else, by horseback, was to Pauloboro, which is now the town of Wiscasset. It took him 3 weeks to get from the Boston area to Pauloboro up in Wiscasset to have the court in a tavern. You could only travel like 10 miles to 15 miles a day, and then you had to stop and rest, primarily to rest the horses, to change the horses, and it was pretty rough going, so it took time to do that. So that's kind of important. It's also, and we'll talk about the U.S. mail a little bit later, but this was basically acted as at a post office. Your taverns were like a post office. And it's not, don't think of like the post office we have today. Basically, the people that wanted to get some message to another settlement would bring in a message or a package, a letter or package, and they'd lay it on a table in a tavern. When there was enough gathered up that it paid the horse rider, something like you think of Pony Express, think of it that way, although we didn't call it Pony Express here, they would deliver it to the next town. And later on with the stagecoaches, they would put on the stages that would go to the next town. So they put the letters in. Now, it was all what we call now is COD, collect on delivery. The receiver is the one that paid for the postage. And they paid for it according to the number of miles that it traveled. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. They also, these taverns also served as the headquarters for the local militias. Remember, we were required to have local militias. And an example of that would be the Jed Prouty Tavern, which we'll have a picture of a little bit later. It's in the book. For example, at the Jed Prouty Tavern in Bucksport, you have Danny Webster stayed there, Martin Van Buren stayed there, William Henry Harrison, Jefferson Davis, Andrew Jackson, James Monroe, John Tyler, and Martin Van Buren stayed there. So this was the place where they had their meetings and they met, did business, and traveled to the next place. The taverns, it's also important to understand that the food actually costs more than the lodging. It was not unusual to cost a day's pay to have a meal at a tavern. So what travelers, again, didn't travel very much, but when they did, it was kind of expensive in today's scheme of things. Next slide, please. Now, in the 1775, 1776 timeframe, when they had the Battle of Lexington and Concord, at this time, again, lumber was the primary export to England. So the British, to make sure they got the lumber, had British warships that would be moored, anchored off Machias and off Falmouth, which is now Portland, to basically manage the traffic going in and out and to make sure the taxes were paid on the products that were moving in and out. So the picture you see on the left is the Burnham Tavern, and that's kind of significant because just a few weeks after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the word got to Maine, the District of Maine, that all of a sudden we weren't supposed to do business with the British. Well, the town was kind of divided at the time because, again, 80% of the business was doing with England. But if they sold the lumber, then they were violating what the Revolutionary War people wanted. And if they didn't do it, then they were going to get bombarded by the British ships around in the port. So they met in the Burnham Tavern. The local residents met there. And again, it was very divided. And they decided that they were going to do something about it. They were not going to provide the lumber anymore. Well, the lumber was very important because it was being cut and shipped down to Falmouth, now Portland, to use to build British barracks. Well, again, that kind of goes against the war. If you're on the revolutionary side, why do you want to be building barracks for the British? So they decided they were going to take the captain of the British fleet, by the last name of Mowat, you read about it in the book. They were going to capture him and say, we're not going to do this anymore. Well, they were going to capture him while he was sitting in church, but he saw through a window they were coming, and you read more about it in the book. So he escaped, and they chased him down to Falmouth, the Portland area, and that's the Alice Greel Tavern that you see on the right there. That's when they had that was the headquarters there to stop the British from doing business there. And that's very significant because if you look at history at that time, almost the entire section of what we know as India Street all the way down Commercial Street was bombarded heavily. And the battle was being fought, basically, the headquarters out of this Alice Greel Tavern. So that's a very, very interesting story in the book. It was very interesting when we researched it and looked into that. And that Alice Greel Tavern sits about where India Street location is now. And after the thing was bombarded, the center of Portland actually moved up to what we look at as the Old Port area now. But basically, that was the center of town, down there where the ships come in now for the ferries and the cruise ships that come into Portland. That was basically the area. Next slide, please. Now, delivering the mail. Benjamin Franklin was appointed by the British at age 31 as the postmaster of Philadelphia. In 1753, he was appointed by the British Crown to be the postmaster of all 13 colonies. So after the Revolution, you see that, notice that's in July of 1775, he got that same job appointed by the Second Continental Congress. So he became the Postmaster General of the U.S. Postal, what we now know as the U.S. Postal Service. And he traveled widely to establish his postal service. The only reason the roads ever changed from rutted paths later was because when the British came to Maine, they said the roads were too impassable. We can't get the mail up there. We can't get up there to have our meetings. So you have to build some roads. So basically, having to deliver the mail was the reason they used to build these roads. He traveled to the province of Maine, or the District of Maine, as it's sometimes called, along what's known as King's Highway, which now from Kittery to Portland was later known as the Post Road for the Postal Service. So that connected the local communities. Franklin supposedly rode this post road on a carriage measuring the miles in a homemade odometer. He did not invent the odometer, but he adapted it for use for his purposes. And he ordered the assistants to place stones marking the miles to Boston. 2 of those markers are within 2 miles of where I live in Cumberland right now, and they're still in existence. So basically, if you see a marker, and for example, the one down the street from where we live says B136, that means it's 136 miles to Boston. So if somebody's mailing a parcel or a letter from Boston to what is now Cumberland, Maine, they're going to have to pay for that postage based on 136 miles. Next slide, please. This is the odometer that he invented. It still is in existence. One of the dials is not in good shape. And if you notice, there's 3 dials. And basically, the dial on the left is for the circumference of the wagon wheels. And I never thought of that, but every wagon wheel would have different wagons, would have different size wheels. So they had to have that. But then the rest of them were the rotations of the wheel, and it's so many rotations per mile. So it's like your odometer on your automobile today. So this is actually still in existence, and you can see it at one of the museums. Next slide, please. Moving on to the early 1800s. Well, first of all, we're back to the 1600s. William Everett's Tavern in Elliot. When Maine was deciding whether it wanted to be a separate state or not, Massachusetts wasn't crazy about it. They said, no, you belong to Massachusetts. So they came up and they met in William Everett's Tavern in Elliot and said, we want you to pledge now that you submit yourself to Massachusetts. You're not going to go off on this tangent and become a separate state. So back then they said, they had enough people that voted and said, okay, we want to do this. Remember, their business was with Britain, so they had to keep the powers to be in Massachusetts happy. So they basically submitted to Massachusetts and said, okay, we're not going to mess around trying to separate. Well, after the Revolutionary War, in 1779, in that time frame, the Jameson Tavern in Freeport, which still exists, it's right next door to L.L. Bean for those who want to take a look at it. It's become known as the birthplace of Maine, although that's in dispute by some historians, and you can read about that in the book. But allegedly, this is where the people met and signed the paperwork to declare Maine to become a separate state. As you know from your history, Maine did become a separate state as part of the Missouri Compromise in 1820. So those are 2 significant taverns. The William Everett's Tavern, that's the plaque where it stood down in Elliot. It's no longer there, but the plaque is there. And the Jameson Tavern still exists, and those are very significant. Next slide, please. One of the questions we got when we were traveling around is, are there any haunted taverns in Maine? Well, you can read in the book that there are taverns that were allegedly haunted that existed in Durham, Freeport, Bar Harbor, Kennebunkport, Bethel, Rockland, Greenville, Poland Springs, Dedham, Searsport, Kennebunk, and Falmouth. there's some very interesting and intriguing stories about some of these haunted taverns, and it's interesting reading. Again, most of it is myth, but they still have a lot of visitors that stop by there and say, oh no, I've seen her walk through the halls at night, or I've seen this or that. So that's just an interesting side trip in one of the chapters in the book. Now, next slide, please. Kathy will start talking to you about the tea rooms in Maine.
Good evening. I hope all of you had a glass of cool iced tea today since it was so hot out. Tea first arrived from China in the port of London in the middle of the 1600s aboard the ships of the East India Company. And from there, it spread throughout the world and became the most widely consumed beverage on earth after water. And from there, it spread to the America, and it became instantly a hit with men and women, and they all enjoyed the teas, and especially New Englanders like their tea. And tea, along with coffee and other beverages, were served in the taverns at the time through the 1700s and the 1800s. And these establishments were all dominated by men. Men owned the taverns primarily. The men frequented the taverns, and the women were not allowed to come in there unless they were accompanied by a male. They had to be escorted. Now, this was a very strict social code of this time frame, and women could not, they could do anything in their house by themselves, but if they left the house and went outdoors to go shopping or visiting or going out for a cup of tea, they had to be escorted by a male. And if they didn't and weren't, then they were considered not respectable and were scorned by people, saying, oh my heavens, that woman is eating and drinking in the taverns. So she probably wouldn't have wanted to do that anyway because of the smells and the smoke and the noise in the taverns. But the taverns were one of the first establishments that started serving tea. And they also sold dry, loose tea that you could make your own tea with. But again, the woman couldn't go into the tavern to purchase that tea because unless she was escorted in there. So a lot of times it was the male figure, either the husband or an uncle or a male servant that could purchase the tea at the tavern and take it home for the women to drink. Well, this was great, but the women really didn't care for it. And they decided that this was difficult and demeaning for them. So they wanted to see if they couldn't visualize how to change that social custom. And by the early 1900s, tea rooms provided the answer for that. When they decided that they were going to be, we are respectable women and we would like to eat out and we would like to have a cup of tea out in public. So they started thinking of how they could change this. And by this time, women were starting also to demand more independence in their lives, in literature and in education and in women's working fields and in their society. And they also were looking for more political power. So as you'll see by reading the book, the tea rooms helped the women to establish all those demands. The tea room served no alcohol and had a home-like atmosphere. And this was very comforting to women when they chose to dine out because they didn't have to worry about having a male escort to take them to the tea room. And they also didn't have to deal with other diners that were over imbibing in alcohol. So it was very comfortable for them to be able to go to a tea room. And most women don't think anything of it today to go out to have lunch or to go out to have a tea, but that wasn't always the case. And the tea rooms helped establish that in society. Now, opening and operating a tea room played an integral part in allowing women to become a part of the business world that up until now was really run by men. The women had decided that they wanted to enter the world of tea rooms because it was such a comforting and profitable thing for them to do. So one of the things that we've tried to do in this book is to show the great variety of the tea rooms. All across the state, women were opening tea rooms, and their many talents made the tea rooms very popular. A skilled operator, a skilled owner or manager of a tea room was able to get the respect and admiration of all in the community, and they held a very enviable position. And it didn't matter where the tea rooms were located. Every one of them had its own unique look and charm. And when they were all when they were all operating, they were all very successful. So in order to focus on how different the tea rooms were, next slide, please. This was a slide that would show you how it looked as a very elegant tea room in Ogunquit. And it started off as a tea room and eventually went into offering overnight accommodations. Next slide, please. So this, if you can see this one, is these next couple of them show the interior of Cherry New Tea Room in Elliot. And it was totally designed by the two women that ran the tea room. And when we featured 30 different tea rooms in our book, we tried to point out how unique each one was. And by reading the little description underneath the photo or the tea room, you get to see what made them all unique. Next slide, please. This is another one that was in West Cumberland, and you can see on the left is the outside of the tea room, how different it looked from the previous slide. And on the right is the inside of the tea room, and that was very unique too, and it was proved to be popular with all of their customers. Next slide, please. And now this one was in the Eastland Hotel in Portland, and it was all decorated with authentic Danish decorations. The owners, the Rhines people, went on various vacation trips and decided they wanted this tea room to resemble a tea room that they had visited in Europe. And so they purchased items and brought them back and decorated the tea room so it looks like an authentic Danish tea room. Next slide, please. In Maine, a lot of the tea rooms were designed to capture the tourist dollar. And each tea room had their own special dish that they were noted for. And most of them had a gift shop. And some of them also had overnight accommodations and even had gas pumps out front, all while being a symbol of sophistication and culture. Now, next slide, please. The tea rooms became so popular that in addition to serving afternoon teas, they started to hold women's movement meetings there. The women's movement was going through a lot of change during these years when the tea rooms were there. There were temperance meetings, there were suffragette meetings, there were ladies' social club meetings, and they also had an abundant growth of the number of tea rooms that were around Maine. And the peak decade for tea rooms was 1920s. The country and Maine were growing so fast with the tea rooms, they attributed it to three things. The first was the equality quest for women. They wanted to be equal. As next was the temperance and suffrage movements. And the third factor was the advent of the automobile. Now, during the early years of the 1900s, next slide, please. This is another one that is down in Ogunquit, and it was a place where they held a lot of the meetings for suffragette and the women's social clubs. And during the early years of the 1900s, America's taste for tea began developing at a rapid speed. So in an effort to keep up with all of the service of the tea in the tea rooms, they started making what was known as tea balls. And that was, they would take a teaspoon of tea and put it in a muslin pouch and then tie it with a cotton string. And this convenient way of making tea was soon became very popular because it was a lot faster than it was to brew tea with loose tea. Next Next slide, please. Now, during the 1920s, the US technological advances led to the development of machinery that could make and pack gauze tea bags. So from then on, there were periodic advances that produced different tea bags. The first tea bag that was produced by machine was a folded double tea bag that you see on the left, on the top, on the left. And then a round tea bag was developed, and next was the square tea bag. And in the 1990s, a pyramid shaped bag, which was it's on the lower left. And tests were done at the Imperial College of London. And it proved that all of the tea bags that they tested, those pyramid shaped ones, released 87% of their flavor, compared to the other tea bags, which only released 67%. And the pyramid shape gave the best tea bag, best cup of tea using a tea bag, and compared the best to tea made with loose tea. Another interesting side effect mentioned in the book occurred in the 1870s to enhance the pleasure of attending afternoon teas. Tea gowns were invented. Now, debate at the time was raging in the fashion magazines of the day as to the dangers of tight lacing, and corsets were absolutely essential wear during that time, especially for the ladies who wished to achieve the 18-inch waist that was in vogue. But this attire caused all manner of medical problems, and many spoke out against the risks involved in wearing such garments. Next slide, please. So as a result, afternoon tea gowns were designed to allow the female body a little more freedom than the formal Victorian dress did not. They were perfect for the informality of tea with your friends, but they were never ever intended to be worn when going out to tea. Now, all of the top fashion houses in London and Paris offered an elaborate range of gowns. And they were expensive, but for the economy minded, a gown could be made with silk or with flowered muslin. And with the start of World War I, elegance and indulgence came to an end and lifestyles changed. Tea gowns disappeared and then were replaced by the cocktail dress, and afternoon tea gowns were abandoned forever. Now, next slide, please. Tango tea dances are also mentioned in our book. And this was an exotic and risque dance that originated in Argentina, and it was called the tango, and it led to nationwide enthusiasm for tango tea dances. People flocked to the elaborate tea rooms in the larger hotels, and there was the large hotels always, in addition to their tea room, always had a dance floor in their tea room. So people would come to the tea room to have tea, but also to dance. And there was always a full orchestra that was there, and they were always open to everybody, except there was a complete reversal from earlier times, because if a man wanted to attend the tea dance, they had to be accompanied by a woman, which was a complete reversal from the earlier times. And everybody enjoyed it. And the college students came all the time because they got to learn the new dances at the tea dances. And newspaper columnists filled their columns with descriptions of what people wore and what dances they were learning. And gala tea dances were also held for fundraisers for local charities. Once Prohibition came, then the tea dances, of course, became extremely popular. And the young people attended in droves to learn what was called then the animal dances, like the bunny hop and the foxtrot and the grizzly bear. Even though the older generation protested that the dances were too vulgar and were encouraging young people to practice loose morals, their popularity continued until the beginning of the 1940s, when the smart set grew fonder of the cocktail hour than the tea dances. And so tea dances eventually ceased. But there's a big revival today of the tea world itself, and tea dances are coming back, and they're now in vogue again and are still extremely popular. Now, It's our hope that this book will provide a better understanding of the particular segment of Maine's social history, and also of the large contribution that women played in the tea movement of the 20th century. Now, tea rooms added a great value to their way of life, and they were promoting independence for women, and they also established, next slide, please. Tea rooms established the hiring of college girls as waitresses, the replacing of the male maitre d' with female hostesses, the acknowledgement that women could succeed in business. They also established the use of colorful restaurant names to replace common family names. So instead of the Jones Tea Room, it was maybe the Lilac Tea Room, something that was more appealing. They also established that money could be made in the food business without serving alcohol. Next slide, please. They also established that there was an outlet for goods made from arts and crafts movement, because a lot of the tea places had, in addition to tea for sale, they also offered antiques or baked goods or arts and crafts. The use of candles and flowers as a permanent tabletop decor was also established by tea rooms. The restaurant interiors were restyled to showcase atmosphere, elegance, and relaxation, which was a definite improvement over some of those old tavern tea rooms. The realization that women and families constitute a solid customer base was really a great thing for tea rooms to establish, because now the women who were just starting out in business with these tea rooms could now have a solid customer base, and their tea rooms were successful. They also established that popular outdoor dining was here to stay. Next slide, please. As Henry James once said, there are a few hours more agreeable than the hour dedicated to the ceremony known as afternoon tea. Thank you.
Next slide, please. As Kathleen mentioned, you can buy the copies of the book at the bookstore for the Historical Society, which I would like you to do to support the Historical Society. It's also available at local bookstores. Sherman's Bookstores has them. The None Such Books in Mill Creek has it. Books of Maine will have some coming in soon, but we would rather have you buy them from the local bookstores and support local and from the Historical Society. But you also can order them from our website, historymaine.com, and you can get copies of this book and our previous book there. So again, thank you very much, and we're open for questions.
Thank you, Kathy and Bill. What an interesting topic, and what a fun social history topic. Getting some questions from the audience. Did you include the tea room at Greeley's Landing, Sebeck Lake near Dover Foxcroft? Is that featured in the book?
That one is not in the book. It was very interesting to us when we started on this journey, because we knew that there were some that were very popular, but the more we looked and the more we researched, the more we discovered, and we were limited in how many we could put into the book. So that was a factor in how many we could put in there, but also we're learning every time someone talks to us about the book, they mention another tea room that we knew nothing about. But we're learning that they were all over the state and they were all successful.
Do you know about how many taverns and tea rooms you actually featured or studied in the book?
There's 30 taverns, 30 tea rooms that we discussed and gave a little paragraph about what their specialty was and where they were located. And taverns were what?
But to answer your question, there were 30 taverns in the book too. We were limited to 30 photos in the book for each one of the subjects. But we looked at, we did the research. I looked at probably about 115 or 120 different taverns.
Wow.
And we had to narrow it down, but we tried to put a cross section in different parts of the states. For example, one of the chapters in the book talks about how they went from taverns to inns to hotels. So we know that there weren't many settlements in interior northern Maine. So you'll see some of the hotels in Aroostook County and Washington County, Maine, and up in the Penobscot County, for example, are listed in the book as further on. So we tried to include a good cross section. We tried to include those that had a significant impact on history, like the Burnham Tavern and the Alice Greel's Tavern and the Jameson Tavern, things like that. So we tried to do it from that point of view.
And the other thing that we found very interesting was how different they all were. Most of them, because of the time frame, were styled basically the same. But when you get into the 1920s, 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s of the tea rooms, then you start seeing what a great variety there are. I mean, in the book, there's everything from a room in a woman's house to a gristmill to a castle. And there's all sorts. So that was one of the goals that we had, was to try and present the different varieties so you could see how many there were.
One of the things that are in the book that Kathy didn't focus on too much, but I found intriguing, was they had the Lakewood Theater up in Madison, and you had the theater down in Surrey. And those were summer theaters. And it's kind of neat because they had significant tea rooms. As a matter of fact, the one in Surrey now has a tea room again because it's making a comeback. But it was interesting to see how Joseph Cotton came through there, and Henry Fonda came through there, and Carol Burnett, and all these. It was very interesting to me that the people that we know today and watch did a lot of their summer stock theaters at these two main theaters.
So two main theaters, yeah.
Traveling around and doing that research.
Wow. Now, do you know, is this something, these types of establishments, would they be found all over the country? I mean, I imagine this is not really very unique to Maine, but where else might you find, similar establishments? Are they everywhere? Is it just a New England thing?
The taverns were primarily in New England, New York, Pennsylvania area. You think of the 13 colonies, that's basically where the taverns started. You have some later on that turned into more, when you start moving west, what we know as taverns sort of became saloons, that type of thing. Now, they still were stagecoach shops, and they still, had mail and delivery there and so forth. So it was a similar thing. On the very first slide that I showed you, you saw a picture of a stagecoach, and that was intriguing to me when I did the history of it, because think of a sheet of plywood, 4 feet by 8 feet. That was the size of a stagecoach. That's it. So when you see that picture on the cover, you see there on top, more people rode on top of the stagecoach than rode inside. And that to me was fascinating. And that particular one happens to be the Concord Coach, which you read about in the book, which from Concord, New Hampshire, but it's one of the designers and engineers of those was from Maine. So there's a Maine connection. But I was intrigued to find out how they could only go like 10 miles a day, and they had to stop to rest the horses, and the people had to stop, rest their behinds and get something to eat. It was very brutal travel.
Now, with the tea rooms, you have to remember the time frame. Again, it's the early 1900s until probably 1940s. And one of the big things was the advent of the automobile. And once the automobile came into being, then people, of course, were traveling farther apart than they weren't just staying in Maine, they were going all over the country. And when they did that, it was so popular to take for a weekend to be a day tripper and take your car and go out to go antique shopping and stop at a tea room on the way. And it was so popular that the car companies were producing maps, road maps.
Wow.
If you go here, here's the tea room. And if you go over here, there's a nice antique shop.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very popular. And it was all over the country by the 1920s. It was all the way from California, all through the Midwest and back down south. Not so much down in the south, but through the Midwest and back over to the East Coast.
And it's intriguing because it ties into the railroad book, because a lot of the ladies at the time took the trolleys out to Riverton Park in Portland, or my grandmother talked about taking the trolley out to the one Pride's Forest out in Cumberland. The ladies would get on the trolley and go out there to escape the tenement heat in Portland in the middle of the
right.
Would go out there and have their tea, or they'd come to Yarmouth, had a very significant tea room. And the picture on the tea room that's on the first slide that you showed is a tea room that was in Yarmouth, and that was actually a trolley stop as well. So that's kind of, they all tied together. We really made it fascinating.
Someone is mentioning a place in their hometown that was a tavern that changed to a tea room during Prohibition and then back to a tavern. Was that, do you know, was that fairly common?
I tend to think it probably wasn't just normally a tea room. It probably stayed a little bit of a tavern. Plus
A tea room.
That's kind of neat because when you did that tea room, when the Prohibition came in, the people like the Danish tea room in Portland put a sign out and advertising the letter T, which stood for tea. So I thought that was kind of an interesting connection that they wanted, hey, we're losing our alcohol business. How are we going to go on? And that's how they did it. It was fascinating.
Someone else mentioning the Maine department store in Waterville opened in 1912 with a Japanese tea room on the 3rd floor and gone after World War II. How common was it to have tea rooms in department stores?
when the tea rooms became so successful, when they were individual tea rooms and the automobile came into being, then people started moving or driving to the cities to do their shopping. When that happened, the department stores started being built. And when the department stores were built, they were seeing all these individual small tea rooms everywhere being very successful. So they started incorporating tea rooms into their department stores. Maine, of course, was pretty rural compared to the rest of the country, but there were tea rooms in some of the department stores. I'm sure there probably was one in the store in Waterville and some in Portland. If you look at, in the book, I mentioned a couple of big department stores that are across the country that had such big clientele for their tea rooms that they had annual events in addition to being just a tea room. And one of the ones that I talk about was the store in Chicago that was run by Selfridge, Mr. Selfridge.
Mm-hmm.
He was so successful with putting tea rooms into the department store in Chicago that at one time that store had 6 tea rooms in the one store. And it was so successful, he cashed in his interest in the company and moved to London and opened up a tea room there. And if you watch PBS, you've probably seen the program about Selfridges.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the 2nd largest department store in London now. And you can still go there and have tea.
A number of people are asking, can you speak at all to current taverns and tea shops? Like where, if people are interested in this kind of experience in Maine today, do you know where they can go? Are there some that are very old or is this, you know, where the movement of like the tea room is coming back? Are they all more modern?
If you drive down to, is it Concord or Wells? It's an Irish pub there now. That's the original tavern that was there. I forget the name of the pub. It's got an Irish name, but it is in the book. But if you go there, a lot of the part of the decoration in there is still the original tavern decoration. And if you go to the Burnham Tavern in Machias, that's actually a museum now that's run by the Daughters of the American Revolution, and it's on the National Historic Register. So that's kind of significant. The Jameson Tavern in Freeport, you can go in there, and they've kept one room upstairs where allegedly the ghost lady was, and some of the carvings were from the time they allegedly signed the document to make Maine a separate state still exists. So there are some pieces and parts, but most of the taverns now are it's called a Fields Western Irish Pub in Wells, and it was 1619, and it's still there. It's just an Irish pub now. One of the interesting ones, what was I going to talk about? The taverns. Oh, the Seth Spring Tavern, which is on Saco Island, between Biddeford and Saco. If you go across there and you look and you'll see a yellow building it's in the book, but that was Seth Springs Tavern. It's now the offices of Deering Lumber.
Deering Lumber, yeah, I know right where that is.
That building still exists, and what's kind of neat is they had a French general who came over here and was actually led forces in the Revolutionary War, Marquis de Lafayette.
That's right, yeah.
Did our research, he stayed there. He's almost like Washington slept here. Well, he stayed there quite a bit too, so that's kind of interesting.
For tea rooms, I have, there's a few tea rooms, a few stores around the state that sells tea and tea equipment and cater to just tea. And the new one just opened up in Freeport on the main street. There's one called Homegrown Herbs and Tea in Portland. There's the Jordan Pond House in Seal Harbor. There's one in Falmouth, the European Tea Room. They offer tea parties. You have to call and talk to them. There's a lovely one in South Portland called Nellie's Tea. And I'm not familiar with that, but she has wonderful tea paraphernalia. There's almost every kind of tea you want, and she does offer tea parties. So you can call up and reserve time for a tea party. And one other one I know of is in Bridgeton, and it's called the Clipper Merchant. And they offer themed tea parties, and they also offer a high tea. So if you go on the web and probably Google tea rooms or tea parties, it probably would.
There's a lot, yeah. There's a lot out there still.
She mentioned the Jordan Pond House in Seal Harbor. That's used to be on what Green Mountain, which is now Cadillac Mountain. That still is ongoing today. That same tea room, Jordan Tea Room, Jordan Pond, and the photo on one of the photos on the front of the book is the staff, the original staff that worked there, and you can see the number of people in that photo. That was quite an establishment. What, there probably 15 to 20 people there on staff, which when you think of tea rooms, I think of something small and quaint. And some of these were very, very busy. So they had quite a staff, but that one still exists today. And they used to take the Cog Railway, it's in the book, my railroad book, up to the top of then Green Mountain, which is now Cadillac Mountain, and they'd spend the day and they would have tea. And they are also famous for food up there, which is in the book. Was the popover or?
No, that's the Jordan Tea Room. The Green Mountain was famous, of course, for its wonderful views. All of the bay.
A number of people are asking about, specific establishments, and I'm sure too, if they read the book, they can learn even more. Did you do any research that might include the Salmon Falls Tea Room in Hollis that was established by Kate Douglas Wiggin and her sister?
It's in the library. It's in the library. It still exists there now. There's a photo in the book that I took of the building as it is today. That's a very interesting one.
As a retired librarian, I think it's one of my favorite tea rooms because it was established by Kate Douglas Wiggin, who was an author herself for children's books that you can see today. They're still available today. And
nice.
A delightful place.
How about, let's see, any taverns in North Yarmouth, specifically one that was run by Jonathan Mitchell? Does that ring any bells?
There is one in North Yarmouth. Hold on a second. Can't remember the name of it, but we'll get there. It's right at the end of Main Street when you're coming out of Cumberland. The Buxton Tavern, red building right at the T, there where North Yarmouth and Main Street coming into Cumberland would be, and that was a very significant. Now that's kind of neat because that was on the stagecoach route coming from the docks down in Yarmouth to head up towards what is now Lewiston Auburn area. That was a main thoroughfare for trade. So they would stay there, and they were driven by the stagecoaches there, but they had oxen that would pull the supply wagons, and it was a regular industrial route that was going up through there. Now the people in the stagecoaches stayed in the Buxton Tavern. The drovers and the workers stayed across the street in poor man's housing or across the street. But it's very interesting. And when she showed you that Prince Tavern in Cumberland, you saw how it had a like a stall opening. That was actually the road that went right through. And the people would get out underneath there to go into the tavern to stay there. But that was the road that went through Cumberland to North Yarmouth and then on up to Auburn. So that was a main route coming through there.
Well, thank you both so much. We're really looking forward to reading the book. Don't forget, if you visit our website, our online store at mainhistorystore.com, you can purchase your copy. You can also find copies of Bill's other book on the history of Maine railroads. And if you're interested in learning more about our upcoming virtual programming, seeing the recording of this program and other programs, be sure to visit our website, mainhistory.org. And of course, Bill and Kathy's website, historymaine.com, correct?
Yes, and I want to thank Madeline Kenny, who's my granddaughter, just said hi. So I thought
that's so great that she was in our audience tonight.
Yeah, she's in Texas. I didn't even know she was going to be.
Wow. Well, thank you. I know thanks is coming in from so many people in our audience. So again, thank you both for sharing your time and your expertise. And thank you everyone for joining us. I hope we can all be back here together again. And I hope we'll all be able to perhaps meet at a tavern or a tea room in person very soon.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Our pleasure.
You'll love it.